good evening. Tonight, we're spending time in the harsh world of medieval medicine, more precisely, in the aftermath of losing a limb. It happened in workshops, on muddy roads, or in battlefields where iron met flesh. And when it did, survival wasn't about healing, it was about enduring. Maybe quiet stories like this help you breathe a little easier. If they do, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if that quiet feels welcome tonight. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's a quiet comfort knowing we're all here, even from far apart. Now, lower the lights, settle in, and we'll ease our way back, slowly, into the Middle Ages. It didn't happen in a chamber with linens and candles. There was no preparation, no decision, no moment of choice. 1 second, a man was pulling a plough, hammering iron, or swinging a rusted blade. The next, something caught, twisted, broke, and tore. Limbs weren't lost with ceremony. They were taken. Taken by horses startled in a crowd, by the splash of boiling pitch in a tannery, by a poorly swung axe, splitting logs too fast before dusk. Fingers were crushed between stones. Arms were trapped beneath wagons. Legs were twisted clean from the socket under the wheel of a cart too heavy for a single man to guide. No one planned for it. No one had time to scream. Just the dull shock of pain and the sick knowledge that something was wrong. Not broken, not bruised, but wrong in a way that would not undo itself. Most people didn't even know if it had happened until the blood told them. Warm, fast and wild, staining wool, soaking earth, making others shout before they even had the breath. Some would try to stand. That was always the worst part. They would try to walk, to crawl, to use a limb that wasn't there anymore. And when they couldn't, they would feel the body catch up with the mind. Some fainted, some screamed, but most just stared at what was no longer attached. Sometimes it was clean, ripped free by the sheer violence of the accident. More often, though, it was a mess. Flesh torn, bone shattered, splinters jutting like jagged sticks from meat that pulsed and didn't know yet it was dying. The wound wasn't neat, it wasn't surgical, it was whatever nature and chance had delivered in that moment, and it was rarely survivable. The places where it happened were never clean. Workshops reeked of grease and soot. Roads were lined with dung and dust and the filth of passing herds. Fields were already heavy with flies. A wound didn't stay fresh. It turned fast, raw meat in the summer air. There were no sterile bandages, no clean water. A torn limb might be wrapped in a tunic or the hem of a skirt. Someone might pour wine over it, if they had any. But mostly, they just held it, tight, hard, until the blood slowed or the patient stopped moving. If you were lucky, someone near you had strong hands. If not, you were left to press down yourself, teeth clenched, eyes wide, whispering things to God or to no one. Pain was immediate, but infection was patient. It waited while you prayed, while you bled, while you begged to keep the light from fading. And still, for many, it wasn't the injury that killed them. It was what came after. No one spoke of the stump like a wound. It was a reminder, a mark, a thing that changed how you walked, how you were seen, how you would live, if you lived at all. If it was your sword arm, your work arm, your ploughing leg, then your use was gone. Not just your balance or your grip, your value. And people noticed. Some would look away, others would help. For a time. But help fades. Meals grew shorter, glances sharper. You weren't the man you'd been. Not the woman who could lift her child or scrub her steps. You were less, not by choice, but by the rough, bloodied truth of the world around you. And the cut, messy, jagged, ugly, had only begun what life would finish. Slowly, unkindly, without pause. The first night was the easiest. That's what they said. Not because it wasn't painful, not because the wound was clean, but because the body hadn't realised yet what had been done to it. The bleeding might have stopped or slowed, or simply soaked into enough cloth and soil that it was no longer noticed. The pain was there, sharp and constant, but dulling at the edges, not from healing, but from exhaustion. You might drift in and out of sleep, or stay awake entirely, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. But the worst hadn't come yet. Not until the next morning. That's when it began, the warmth, the fever, the throb beneath the bandages. It started like pressure, like the wound was pushing outward, like it wanted to grow back or push something out. And in a way, it was. It was pushing against death and losing. The flesh around the injury turned dark, not all at once. First a little pink, then red, then something deeper, the colour of meat left too long in the sun. The bandages were stiff by then, crusted and sour. When they were peeled back, if they were peeled back, the smell was thick and clinging. Not just rot, not just blood, but something deeper. The scent of the body turning on itself. The wound didn't just hurt now. It pulsed, it bubbled, it wept a thin yellow liquid that soaked through cloth and into the straw below. Flies came. Always. You could try to wave them off, but they'd find the wet, warm parts eventually. Sometimes they laid eggs. That was worse than the fever, but only just because now the skin wasn't just discoloured. It was soft, mushy. A finger could press into it and leave a dent. And if it did, the pain screamed back, sharp and deep and cold. There were things they tried. Honey, if it could be spared. Wine, if someone could bear to waste it. Ash, fat, salt, pressed into the wound, with rough fingers and rougher words. Some said it helped, some screamed until they passed out. A few bit down on leather, and survived long enough to see the wound blacken, harden, shrink. But not many, because by the third day the infection wasn't just in the limb, it was in the blood. Fever burned high now, hotter than fire. The injured sweated through blankets, trembled even in the sun. Their lips cracked, their eyes turned glassy. They didn't speak, or if they did, it was to things no one else could see. Some vomited, some convulsed, others simply sank inch by inch into something quieter than sleep. A stillness that scared even those who had seen it before. By then it wasn't about healing, it was about waiting. Waiting to see if the body would give up entirely or fight through with whatever strength remained. Some did live, a few, but they didn't come back whole. The wound would close, maybe, with luck, but not like before. It would twist, scar, remain angry beneath the skin. The fever might subside, but the weakness stayed. For weeks, sometimes forever. Breath short, her limbs shaky, vision blurred at the edges. And always, the fear of it returning, a cut at a scrape, a cold, anything could wake it again. The infection was never truly gone. It slept, in the blood, in the bones, in the dark folds of the body that remembered what had been done and what had nearly ended it. It usually started with the smell. Before the pain changed, before the fever rose higher, before the skin around the wound blackened entirely, there was a smell that drifted into the air and hung there, thick and warm, like rot in a cellar. It clung to fabric, to hair, to breath. People turned their heads when they entered a room, not because of the bandage or the limp, but because they smelled what was underneath before they saw it. The wound had opened again, or maybe it never truly closed. Flesh festered, blood oozed, and deep inside, where cloth and herbs couldn't reach, something else had arrived. Not a healer, not a priest, not a friend. Larvae, small white wet things, moving without eyes or purpose, eating what was dying but still part of a living body. At first, they thought it was a curse, a punishment, a sign the wound had gone beyond help. The patient would scream, or faint, or simply go still, not from pain but from the horror of seeing them, writhing softly in the gap where muscle should be. Someone would try to wash them out. Boil water, scrape with cloth, pour wine or vinegar, and watch them fall to the floor in glistening clumps. But they came back. They always did. Where rot lingered, they followed. Where old bandages met soft flesh and air, they nested. And sometimes, despite the revulsion, the fear, the shame, they did something no human could. They cleaned, not neatly, not kindly, but they removed what the blade couldn't. The dead parts, the grey meat, the stink that made even priests hesitate, The maggots didn't care what they touched, but in not caring, they saved. It wasn't understood, of course. There were no lectures or scrolls explaining the science of it. There were only stories. This man who should have died, he lived. This woman who couldn't walk, now she limps. This boy who cried for days, now he sleeps. And in each story, when you looked close enough, there was a wound that crawled and squirmed before it closed. A wound that welcomed flies before it welcomed skin. Some healers began to leave them in, quietly. Not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate kind of hope. They would change the bandages gently, avoiding the parts that moved. They would say prayers not for deliverance, but for time. Time enough for the maggots to finish their work before the fever returned. And when it worked, when the flesh turned pink instead of black, when the stink faded and the scab formed, no one thanked the worms. But they remembered. Still, it wasn't a miracle. The wound didn't always close. Sometimes the maggots came too late. Sometimes they fed too long. The line between cleaning and consumption was thin, and not everybody could draw it in time. But for those who survived, the memory never left. The soft tickle beneath the bandage, the knowledge that something lived inside the part of them that nearly died, and the strange quiet understanding that without those creatures, without the crawling, silent mouths of things born from filth, they might have gone cold in a shallow grave behind the church, nameless and unmourned. Mercy, in the Middle Ages, did not always come with light. Sometimes it came with wings, with eggs, with movement too small to see at first, but impossible to ignore once it began. And for some that was enough, not a cure, but a chance, a second breath, a way to stay. There was no ceremony to it, no silence, no preparation beyond what hands could find in haste. A blade, a saw, a curved knife still sticky from the last use. Whatever lay close was enough. The person wasn't always conscious, and if they were, it was better not to wait. Too much time meant too much fear, too many chances to thrash, to beg, to die from blood loss before the cut could even begin. The limb itself was already useless, crushed, broken, blackening, or hanging by a thread of skin. There wasn't hope of saving it, only of removing it fast enough that the rot wouldn't climb higher, and so they did. 4 men to hold you down, 1 to cut, 1 to press the iron. The rest useless. They stood back and prayed the screaming would end before the blood did. The first cut was always the worst, not for its pain but for its finality. A slice through skin, quick and deep. No gentle parting, no slow separation. Then the saw, back and forth, rough teeth chewing through tendon and bone. It didn't take long. Not like people imagine. A minute, maybe 2, if the man's hand didn't slip, if the body didn't jerk too much. But it felt longer. To the patient, every second stretched, every vibration of the blade echoed through marrow and mind. Some passed out from the shock, others didn't, and their screams carried through fields, through stone walls, through entire villages. Children were told to stay indoors, animals grew restless, and still the work continued. The limb was severed, and that was only the beginning, because now came the fire. The iron was already heating, a thick, blackened rod, often from the forge, sometimes from a fire pit. Red at the tip, glowing with quiet menace. No one waited, no countdown, no warning, just the smell first, hair and sweat, and something sharper. And then the hiss, the sizzle, the sudden lurch as the iron met the wound. This wasn't just to stop the bleeding, it was to keep death at bay. Cauterization burned more than flesh. It seared shut the open gate where fever and infection would rush in. The skin bubbled, curled, cracked, the blood sealed, and the screaming, if it still continued, became hoarse, desperate, and then finally silent. Not from relief, from exhaustion, from the body giving up, if not entirely, then enough to rest in the haze between life and death. Afterward, there was no applause, no thanks, only the weight of what had been taken, and the smell that lingered on clothes and hands. The patient was wrapped, not cleaned, left to lie on straw, on stone, on a cold bed with no blankets. Fever would come, or it wouldn't. The wound would fester, or it wouldn't. Some survived, and when they did, people whispered their names with a strange mixture of awe and dread, as if something about them had changed, not just their shape, but their fate. They had faced the blade and the fire and had not died. That didn't make them strong. It made them strange, a reminder of what flesh can endure and what it must give up in return. The cut was fast, the fire was final, but the healing, if you could call it that, was something else entirely. Something slower, quieter, and just as brutal. There were no white coats, no learned men with steady hands trained in anatomy and care. The one who cut wasn't always chosen for knowledge, only for the willingness to do it and the strength to follow through. Sometimes it was the village barber, the same man who pulled teeth and drained boils. His knives were sharp enough, though not always clean. His fingers were rough but firm. He knew how to hold someone down, how to work fast before the body gave out. Other times it was the blacksmith, hands used to gripping hot iron and splitting wood, now gripping bone. And in the darker corners of towns, where desperation lived loudest, the man who did the cutting was the one who had taken lives before, the executioner. He wasn't trained in saving people, only in separating them from parts they once called their own. There was no ceremony to asking. It wasn't a request so much as a plea. The injured didn't have the luxury of waiting for a healer with titles or books. They needed someone who wouldn't flinch, who could push a blade through skin and sinew without hesitating. And so they came. Those with scars of their own. Those who had seen death and weren't afraid to be close to it again. They brought whatever tools they had, a hunting knife, a kitchen cleaver, a saw meant for timber or bone. Rarely was anything boiled. Sometimes a rag soaked in spirits passed for preparation. More often, there was only the blade, the wound, and the breath of someone whispering prayers just loud enough to hear. No one checked for a pulse. They only watched for movement, for the twitch of a foot, the rolling of an eye. If there was still life, the work continued. If not, the tools were wiped, and the room fell silent. The ones who cut weren't heroes. They weren't always thanked. Often they were feared, sometimes even shunned. It's hard to look kindly upon the man who took your husband's arm, even if it saved his life. It's hard to sleep near someone who screams your name in the dark, because they still feel the blade in their dreams. Some of them drank, others stayed quiet. A few began to believe their own stories, that they had some gift, some grim touch that allowed them to cut without killing. But most just did what was asked, then left. No one stayed long after the work was done. Blood has a way of changing the air, of thickening it until every breath tastes like iron and regret. They went home, washed their hands in silence, and waited for the next knock on their door. Still, without them, more would have died. That much was certain. In the absence of real medicine, brute skill was the only medicine some had. Not everyone could cut. Not everyone could hold the limb while it jerked, could saw through bone while a mother screamed behind the wall. It took a certain kind of stillness, not coldness, actually just a distance, a way of being near suffering without being swallowed by it. And so the cutting continued, in barns and kitchens, under trees and by firelight. Not by doctors, but by those who dared. And in the end, those who survived didn't remember the face of the one who cut. They remembered the edge, the smell, the moment the pain shifted from sharp to numb. They remembered that someone did what no one else could, and lived with it, whether they wanted to or not. They didn't have a name for it. No one knew how to describe the thing that hurt, even after it was gone. But every night, after the wound had crusted over, and the fever had either broken or taken its toll, the pain returned. Not in the stump, not in the raw, twisted edge of what was left, but in what wasn't there, toes that burned, though they had been buried a week ago, fingers that itched under bandages where no fingers remained, an arm that ached with the dull weight of a phantom bucket, carried only in memory. People tried to explain it in whispers. They said the pain was in the mind or in the soul, or that a ghost had taken residence in the missing part. But the truth was simpler and crueler. The body didn't understand what had happened. It still reached, still felt, still screamed. Sleep became a place of dread, not because of nightmares, but because it promised no rest. The ache would begin as the light faded, as the hearth turned to embers. It started as a tingle, a pull, a tension in the joints that no longer existed. And then it built. It crept up the leg that had been severed. It twisted down the arm that had been burned shut with iron. The sensation wasn't sharp but persistent, like something pulling from the inside out. The person would toss, then sit up, then cradle the absence like a child. Some wrapped the stump in cloth again, hoping pressure would soothe what nothing else could. Others whispered to it, begged it to be quiet. A few screamed, loud and sudden, and startled others in the house into silence. But most stayed quiet, shaking, teeth clenched, sweat on the brow, because they knew this was the price of surviving. The pain that followed you through the dark. No one could help. Not really. Healers offered herbs for sleep, but they dulled the mind more than the body. Arle numbed the senses but made the dreams worse. Wives and brothers sat by the straw mat and held hands that no longer existed, their own fingers gripping empty air. Children asked questions no one could answer. Why does Papa cry if his leg is gone? And the answer never changed. It's nothing. He'll sleep soon, but he didn't. Not really. Even when the body collapsed from exhaustion, the mind remained tethered to what it had lost. The stump twitched, the muscles clenched. The pain came again, slow and patient, like a tide. You could survive the cut, you could survive the fever, but the nights came anyway, and they didn't end. Eventually, it became routine. You woke before it started, you braced for it, you counted breaths, pressed your back against the wall, muttered the same prayers in the same order. And when the ache began, you let it come. Not because you were stronger, but because you were too tired to fight it anymore. You learned to live beside it, like an unwelcome guest who never stopped whispering. Some said it faded over time, that after a year or two the ghost limb quieted, but others swore it never left. That even on the day of death the missing part still screamed to be felt. Not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. The body never knew how to forget itself, and in the Middle Ages, neither did the people inside it. They simply endured, night after night, pain after pain, in silence, because there were no words, only the ache. They didn't lie in clean beds, not the ones with open wounds, not the ones missing parts of themselves. They lay on straw, if they were lucky, on dirt floors if they weren't. Sometimes the straw had been used before, sometimes it was damp from the last patient. The wound was wrapped in cloth torn from old tunics or bedding, whatever could be spared without notice. No one boiled it, no one sterilised it. It was tied tightly, not to keep it clean, but to stop the bleeding. And once it was on, it stayed on. For hours, for days, sometimes until it dried so stiff that removing it risked tearing the flesh beneath. The cloth turned dark, first with blood, then with pus. The smell changed. At first it was sharp, iron and sweat. Then it turned sour. Then something worse, and still the wrapping stayed because changing it meant opening it again, seeing what was underneath, and not everyone wanted to see. The dirt wasn't just around them. It was in the wound, from hands, from tools, from the ground they fell on when the limb was taken. No one washed properly. Water was too precious, soap too rare. A bucket was carried in if someone had the strength, but it didn't last long. The water turned red quickly. Someone might pour wine if they were kind or careless. More often they just let it be, let the body heal on its own. But healing wasn't the right word. The body scabbed, yes, it crusted and thickened, but it also grew warm, swollen, angry. Flies found their way inside, drawn by the sweetness of decay. They laid eggs without permission. The wound crawled before it closed. Some saw it as a sign of failure. Others, strangely, saw it as a sign of life. movement meant the flesh was still something to feed on. The healer didn't come often, not unless he lived nearby or was already owed a favour. And even then, he didn't always bring relief. His tools were no cleaner than the room. His hands had touched death more than life. He would prod, squint, mutter. Sometimes he'd cut away soft parts, not because he knew what he was doing, but because they came away too easily. He might sprinkle ash or honey, or a thick herbal paste that smelled of rot and mint. But it didn't stop the pain. It only quieted the noise of those who watched. He would rewrap the limb, tighter this time, and say nothing. No warnings, no hope, just a nod. And he would leave the way he came, quickly, quietly, before he could be asked to stay longer than he wanted. Outside, life continued. Fields still needed ploughing. Bread still needed baking. The wounded were not sacred. They were not isolated. They lay near the fire or near the door. Wherever there was space, and they healed, if that word still meant anything, in the dirt. Children stepped around them. Chickens pecked too close. Dogs sniffed at the bandages when no one was watching. And still the body tried to mend itself. It swelled and stiffened and held together in the ways it knew. Not cleanly, not efficiently, but stubbornly. Healing, if it came, was not a return. It was a surrender, a closing over of something too wounded to be what it once was. And in the quiet of night, as the flies settled and the fever rose again, that stubbornness was all they had. No medicine, no mercy, just time. And dirt. There wasn't a word for it, not exactly. No name for what a man became after he lost his leg. He was still alive, still breathing, still taking up space near the fire, but not in the same way. Not in the way that counted. A man with one leg couldn't walk the fields, couldn't follow the ox, couldn't carry wood from the forest or stones from the river. He couldn't stand long enough to forge or to plough. He couldn't run if the wolves came or fight if the village was raided. He sat. That was what he did now. Sat by the doorway or in the shade, where others passed by without looking, not out of cruelty, just because they no longer knew what to say. He was a presence, not a part, something left behind by the world that kept moving. Marriage, too, was no longer spoken of. Not for him. No father would offer his daughter to a man who couldn't provide, couldn't build, couldn't defend. The promise of children faded with the promise of labour. No dowry, no home, just silence and a kind of invisible wall between what he once might have had and what he had now. If he already had a wife, the silence stretched differently, not cruel, but cautious. She carried more now, lifted more, worked more, and in the evenings she sat across from him, hands raw, eyes tired, saying nothing about the leg that wasn't there. They didn't speak of love. They didn't speak of loss. Only of the things that still needed to be done. The goats, the bread, the firewood that didn't chop itself. And he, sitting there, tried not to notice how much faster she moved when he wasn't in the way. The village adjusted. It always did. One fewer man in the rotation. One fewer back in the harvest line. Sometimes he was given tasks that could be done while seated, mending, carving, sorting grains. But even those were gestures, not necessities. He wasn't efficient, not like the young boys or the strong-backed cousins. He was a reminder of what could happen. A story told through flesh and absence. Children stared at first, then they stopped. And the man with one leg faded into the background, present but no longer essential. His opinions were no longer sought. His advice, when given, was accepted with polite nods and quickly forgotten. He was not mocked. He was not hated. He was simply no longer needed in the way men were supposed to be. And so he sat, morning to night, watching others live a life that had once been his, hearing footsteps he couldn't follow, seeing the curve of tools he could no longer lift. The leg he lost took more than bone. It took motion, status, future. It took the rhythm of daily life and replaced it with stillness. And in that stillness, something else grew. Not bitterness, not always, but something quieter, a kind of dullness, a sense of being an object that had once been a man. They said he was lucky to have survived. And maybe he was, but survival didn't mean return. It meant sitting, listening, waiting, and knowing deep down that what was gone had taken more than anyone else could see. At first they brought food to where you sat, a crust of bread, a wooden bowl with stew, a ladle of water left by the hearth. They didn't speak much while doing it. Just set it down near your good hand and walked off to finish whatever task the day had already demanded of them. You thanked them, at first, whispered it softly, looked down, made yourself small, and they nodded, or didn't. You told yourself this was temporary, that once the wound closed, once the fever passed, once you could lift yourself without groaning, you'd be useful again. But days passed, then weeks, and though the pain dulled and the stump no longer bled, your place remained the same, near the door, near the ashes, near the part of the room no one used unless they had to. You started to notice that your bowl came later, that the crusts were smaller, that the broth was thinner. Not poisoned, just different. No one said anything. It wasn't cruel, it was quiet. There were children to feed, elders to tend, animals that had to eat before the light left the sky. Food wasn't measured in kindness. It was measured in hands. How many could sew? How many could lift? How many could carry water up from the well without dropping the bucket? You couldn't. Not anymore. You tried once, dragged yourself outside, called to the boy to bring the plough closer so you could inspect the yoke, and you fell. Hard, mud on your face, a crack in your teeth, and the look on your brother's face wasn't anger, it was pity. That was worse. They helped you back to the threshold, set you down gently, but after that, no one asked again. They didn't ignore you, they just stopped including you, as though your name had become a thing whispered in the past tense. Eventually the bowl stopped coming every day. Sometimes they forgot, sometimes there simply wasn't enough to go around. In lean years, everyone thinned out. But you hollowed, your clothes hung looser, your eyes sank. You tried to smile more, tried to show gratitude, offered advice, sang to the baby, carved something from wood that no one had asked for. But it didn't change the arithmetic. There were too many mouths and not enough loaves. And when the numbers no longer worked, the body that produced the least, yours, became optional. Not hated, not blamed. Just no longer fed like the rest. You weren't asked to leave. They just stopped filling the space where your bowl used to be. And so you made a choice. The same one many had made before you, and many would make after. You could crawl to the road, find a place near the church or the tavern, and hold out your hands. Or you could stay. In the shed, in the barn, in the part of the house where no one stepped except to fetch tools or stack kindling. And wait. You wouldn't be mistreated, you'd just be forgotten. Slowly, softly, like something set aside and never picked up again. And in that forgetting, there was a kind of death. Not of the body, not yet, but of the self. The part of you that had once earned your place at the table, the part that had been seen. You weren't starved, not exactly, but you weren't fed either, only tolerated, until even that became too costly. They didn't call it work, but it was. Just not the kind that made things or built things or grew things. It didn't fill barrels or sharpen blades or bring home sacks of flour. It was quieter, slower, humbler, but no less deliberate. You found a corner, near the church if you were lucky, by the marketplace if you were bold. Not too close to the stalls, not in the way of the carts, just near enough to be seen, without being stepped over. You sat low, always lower than the others, head slightly bowed, eyes sometimes lifted. You didn't speak first, so that was too much. You waited, let the wound do the speaking, the stump wrapped or unwrapped, depending on the season. The missing arm, the bent leg, the hollow sleeve pinned to your chest. That was your badge now. That was your job. Some people looked away. Children stared, of course, but adults had learned to pretend you weren't there. Some dropped coins, others left crusts. If you were lucky, a whole roll. Once even a piece of cheese. You thanked them, always. Loud enough to be heard. soft enough not to seem greedy. You kept the words simple. Bless you. Mercy on your house. May your son be strong. Little things, words that made you sound smaller than them, grateful, broken but polite. That was part of it. The role, the performance. You weren't just begging, you were reminding of pain, of war, of God. You made yourself an echo of suffering they could feel but walk away from. You had to be just pitiful enough to be worth a coin, but not so pitiful that you became uncomfortable. The others, the real beggars, taught you how. Where to sit, when to move, what to say when the reeve passed by, which priest turned his back, and which one gave alms without being asked. They taught you not to weep. Weeping made people hurry past. They taught you not to laugh. Laughter made them think you didn't need help. They taught you that silence was stronger than words, but only if your wound was visible. You learned the tricks. You learned to time your gaze with the sound of a dropped coin. You learned how to shift the bandage just enough to show the place where bone once was. You learned that a dirty face drew more pity than a clean one. But too much filth made people wrinkle their noses. It was a balance, like any craft, and over time it became routine. Not shameful, just necessary. You weren't proud, but you weren't starving either. You learned the faces of the ones who always gave and the ones who never did. You nodded at the merchant's wife who brought dried fruit on holy days. You avoided the baker's son who liked to spit. You counted the coins at dusk, turning them in your palm with what fingers you had left. And when night came, you didn't sleep in a bed, but you found a place out of the wind. Maybe a doorway, maybe a shed, maybe near the animals where their breath made the air a little warmer. And you told yourself this was survival. Because it was. You had lost a part of your body. And now, with what remained, you worked. Not with tools, but with presence. Not with strength, but with patience. And some days, it was enough. He had stood in the Lord's colours once, his arm wrapped in iron, sword drawn, feet planted in the mud outside some nameless wall. He had taken orders, followed banners, spilled blood that wasn't his, for land he would never touch. When the fighting ended, or when he fell, they carried him back not because of kindness, but because he still breathed and bore the crest. The wound was ugly. The arm had to go. They cut it above the elbow, high and fast, while he thrashed in the dirt and cursed through gritted teeth. They didn't bury him. That was the only mercy. And when he woke days later, feverish and weightless on one side, they told him he was lucky. Lucky to be alive. Lucky to be remembered. Lucky that his name had once been called in the yard when the knights lined up for their share of meat and bread. He didn't return to battle. That much was obvious. But he didn't return to the fields either. His place was neither with the men nor the peasants. So they gave him a room, not a chamber, a space, below the kitchens near the barrels of wine and spoiled grain. Damp, cold, with stones slick from old rainwater and mice that chewed through everything that wasn't iron. He had a mat, a blanket, rough and frayed, sometimes soup if there was extra. No one treated him cruelly, but no one spoke to him like a soldier either. The boys still training with wooden swords didn't know his name. The women passing trays never asked how he slept. He had once protected this place. Now he watched it from the dark, with one arm and a memory of what it felt like to be needed. He tried to make himself useful, sharpening blades with his left hand, carrying messages in his teeth if he had to. But no one wanted a half-man with a limp and 1,000-yard stare. His stories went unheard. His scars went unnoticed. There were new men now, taller and louder, with both arms and fewer ghosts. They drank in the hall. He drank alone when he could sneak something past the steward. Sometimes the Lord passed him in the corridor. Didn't stop, didn't slow, just gave a glance that might have meant gratitude, or pity, or nothing at all. And the man bowed or tried to, not out of respect, but out of habit. Because part of him still believed that loyalty was worth something, even now, even with a stump where his arm used to be, and yet he stayed, because he had nowhere else to go. The village wouldn't feed him, the fields wouldn't wait for him, he couldn't hunt, couldn't forge, couldn't kneel long enough to pray properly. But in the castle, he was allowed to exist, allowed to sit by the fire if no one else was using it, allowed to sleep in a corner where the rain didn't always reach, allowed to eat when others had eaten first. That was what survival looked like for a one-armed soldier. Not glory, not comfort, just space, a quiet corner between use and burden, between memory and absence, between the life he had given and the life they let him keep. They gathered near the steps of the church, men with hollow sleeves, legs bound in leather, faces marked by burns or scars too deep to forget. Some leaned on sticks, others crawled. A few simply sat, backs to the cold stone wall, eyes half closed in the late morning sun. The priests didn't chase them away. In fact, they nodded at them as they passed, robes brushing the edges of their cloaks and mats. The wounded didn't pray aloud. They didn't need to. Their very presence was a kind of offering, a display of pain, a reminder to the unbroken of what it meant to suffer and still be alive. The church, with its incense and echoing chants, welcomed them not as burdens, but as symbols. Their missing limbs spoke louder than any psalm. Their silence was scripture. Inside, near the altar, a few of them were permitted to sit if the weather turned. Not near the front, of course, but along the sides, near the pillars, where the flickering candles met the smell of old wax and damp wool. They didn't ask for alms there. They didn't have to. People saw them. People gave. A coin in the bowl. A heel of bread slipped into a hand on the shoulder, quickly withdrawn. The priests said these men were touched by God's sorrow, that their wounds were mirrors of the passion, that each scar drew them closer to grace. It wasn't pity, it was something else, a reverence built on discomfort. No one wanted to trade places with them, but everyone knew they belonged near the altar more than most. They had already suffered, they had already bled. Sometimes the monks washed their feet. Not often, not all, but a few. Quiet, older ones, who spoke little and moved like their robes weighed more than their bones. They'd bring bowls of warm water and clean cloths, and kneel without ceremony. The wounded said nothing while it happened. Just closed their eyes and let the water soften the cracks in their skin. Let the cloth wipe away dirt no one else dared touch. It wasn't healing, but it was something close to forgiveness. For what, no one said. Perhaps for surviving, perhaps for still needing, perhaps for daring to remain visible in a world that wanted them tucked away, out of sight, out of thought. And when processions came, saints' days, feast days, holy relics paraded through the square, the wounded were placed near the front. Not marching, but sitting, watching, bearing witness. Their presence gave weight to the ritual, made the incense thicker, the hymns sadder, the faith deeper. People wept as they passed them, not because they knew their names, but because their wounds made the divine feel closer. The church understood that, used it, honoured it in its own way. Not with rooms or titles, but with space, with acknowledgement. And so the wounded stayed, not because it was warm, not because it was generous, but because here, at least, they were seen. And being seen, in their condition, was the closest thing they had to meaning, to value, to peace. They weren't elegant, they weren't hidden. The first thing people noticed wasn't the wooden arm or the stump wrapped in rawhide. It was the way the body moved with it. Awkwardly, slowly, like something was being dragged behind the ribs with every step. The prosthetics of the Middle Ages were not built for comfort or function. They were symbols, clumsy, heavy, cracked with use, but they meant something. They meant the person hadn't given up on movement, that they still wanted to stand, to lift, to hold, that they still wanted to walk into the square without crawling, even if every step brought pain. The parts were crude, iron rings, splintering wood, thick rope, dried leather hardened like bark, but they were enough, not for a full life. That was gone, but for a version of it that looked a little less helpless from a distance. Most of them were made at home, not by healers or craftsmen, but by fathers, brothers, neighbours with tools and memories of how the limb used to bend. A branch shaped like a forearm, a leather strap nailed into the end, a hook hammered from a bent nail, or a peg sawed from firewood and smoothed with a blade. They didn't fit well. The straps dug into skin. The edges bruised what was left of the limb. But they offered balance, or at least the illusion of it. A peg leg made stairs possible again, though slowly. A hooked arm helped carry sacks, even if clumsily. These weren't devices, they were declarations. You weren't whole, but you weren't gone. Not yet. Children stared at them. Some were afraid, others were fascinated. They whispered about the man with the iron hand, the woman with the stick leg who could still chop wood. And though the injured rarely smiled, they carried those stares like armour. Better to be seen as strange than as useless. Better to wear a crooked limb than to be carried like a sack of flour. They adapted, learned to lean on doorways, to shift weight, to pivot without stumbling. They practiced alone when no one watched, falling in private, gritting teeth, pulling themselves upright again with the fury of someone who knew no one was coming to help. Over time, their gait became theirs. Not normal, never smooth, but familiar. The rhythm of a body stitched together with rope and willpower. But the cost was steep. Not in coins, though even nails and leather weren't free, but in effort, in skin rubbed raw, in nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if it would have been easier to crawl forever. Some gave up. Let the wood gather dust, let the straps fray. Returned to stillness, to waiting. But others endured. Not because they believed they'd regain what they'd lost, they knew they wouldn't, but because the movement itself was all they had left. A way to mark the hours. A way to stay part of the world, even if that world stared, even if it winced, even if it turned away. They moved anyway. One arm, one leg, wood and rope. Not freedom, but something close enough to pass. They told stories about him, not right away, not when he was still lying feverish in a tower room, half conscious, soaked in sweat and wine and blood. Not when the healer peeled back his bandages and muttered something grim beneath his breath, but later, once the wound had closed, once the skin had scarred over and the pain had settled into something quieter. Then the stories began. How he had stood alone at the breach, how he had held the line when others fled, how he had taken the blow and kept fighting. The truth didn't matter anymore, only the result. He had survived. And survival, when wrapped in silk and stitched into song, could be mistaken for heroism, especially when the man who survived was a knight, and the arm he lost had once held a sword that served a lord. He was still noble, still a man of land and name. That didn't change with the amputation. What changed was how they looked at him. Not with pity, not openly, but with something more complex. A mixture of awe and discomfort. He was a living relic, a breathing monument to a battle that others only heard about. They placed him near the high table during feasts. Not always close, but visible. So guests could glance and murmur. So squires could learn that wounds were part of duty. So poets could find inspiration in his silence. He didn't speak of the pain. He didn't need to. His empty sleeve, tied neatly against his chest, spoke louder than words. And when he walked, slower now, slightly tilted, people stepped aside. They gave him titles, small ones, honorary, defender of the gate, the one-armed sentinel. Things that sounded impressive, but came with no new lands, no real power. Just acknowledgement, a nod to the fact that he'd given something, and that the court would remember it, as long as it was convenient. He still had servants, still had wine, still had a horse, though he rode it rarely now. Mounting was difficult, fighting was impossible, but appearing, being seen, was enough. His presence reminded others that war left marks, that loyalty had a price, and that price, if paid by the right person, could be transformed into legend. Not by healing, but by retelling, again and again, until even he began to forget what really happened beneath the mud and screams. But when the hall grew quiet, when the fire dimmed and the guests went home, he was left alone with the part of the story that didn't fit the songs, the ghost pain that returned each night, the frustration of dressing himself slowly, clumsily, the knowledge that his sword hung above the hearth, not as a weapon, but as decoration. He watched the young men train in the yard, heard the steel clash, saw the sweat on their brows, and felt the weight of his missing arm more sharply than ever. He nodded at them, smiled when they bowed. But inside, something pulled, not with jealousy, but with memory, a remembering of movement, of strength, of being feared, and now only being honoured, from a distance, politely, endlessly. A hero, yes, but a broken one. And legends, no matter how bright, could not bring the limb back, nor the man he was before it was lost. It arrived before you did, before you opened your mouth to speak, before your shadow touched the doorway, before your name was even remembered. The smell announced you. It wasn't sudden, not like fire or smoke. It crept into a room the way rot creeps through wood. Slow, quiet, certain. A mixture of sour cloth, old blood, damp skin, and something deeper, something unmistakably human and undeniably wrong. People knew it, even if they couldn't name it. The scent of a wound that hadn't healed. That wouldn't heal. A wound that had gone soft at the edges, that oozed when it shouldn't, that carried with it the heavy stink of flesh turning against itself. They never said it aloud, but they noticed. They always noticed. No one wanted to be cruel, not directly. They shifted subtly instead, took a step back during conversation, turned their face slightly while speaking, wrapped their shawl tighter around their nose when passing by. They still offered food sometimes, but placed it at a distance, still sat nearby, but never close. The smell lingered in cloth, in bed sheets, in walls. You washed when you could, with cold water and harsh soap, but it didn't matter. The wound made its own scent, one that soaked into the world around it. You could smell yourself when you woke. You could see it in the way the dog avoided your side of the room, in the way children held their breath when walking past. No one spoke of it, and that silence was worse than words. Some tried to cover it, herbs tucked into bandages, lavender pressed under the arm, vinegar splashed on the floor and rubbed on the stump until the skin burned. But nothing masked it for long, because it wasn't just a smell, it was a condition, a sentence, a sign that the healing had not finished, or had gone wrong entirely. And when the wind shifted, or the body warmed, or the fever rose, the smell deepened, thickened, turned metallic, then sweet, then something else entirely. It clung to your breath, to your sleep, to the back of your tongue. Some nights it woke you, not with pain but with the unbearable closeness of your own decay, and you lay still, eyes open in the dark, knowing that even in solitude you weren't alone. The wound was with you, always with you. There were those who lived like this for years, not in agony, but in shame. Quiet, functional, but avoided. They weren't cast out, they were simply repositioned, moved to corners, to back rooms, to seats near open windows. They learned to speak less, to keep movement small, learned to smile only when necessary. Their scent was not who they were, but it defined them all the same. It was a trail they couldn't outrun, a shadow that couldn't be seen, but was felt. In every wrinkled nose, every polite silence, every forced kindness, the body remembered what it had lost, and the air, heavy and warm, remembered too, even after the wound closed, even after the skin turned dry and quiet. The smell lingered, and with it the quiet shame of survival. It didn't start right away. The first days were filled with real pain, the tearing, the burning, the fever that pressed behind the eyes like a second skull. There was no room for anything else then. But later, when the wound had scabbed, when the stump had been wrapped and rewrapped a dozen times, when the skin had sealed over with something tough and ugly, that's when it came. A twitch, a pinch, a spark just under the flesh. Except there was no flesh. The toes were gone. The fingers were buried. The arm had been taken, burned shut with iron, and still they ached. Not gently, not quietly, but sharply, insistently, like they had never left. The pain didn't fade with sleep. It waited, coiled in the dark like a snake with no eyes, and struck just as silently. People didn't believe it at first. They'd see the man jerk upright, clutching the space where his hand used to be, gasping like someone had stabbed him. Some thought it was madness. Others said it was punishment, a sin carried in the nerves. A few believed it was the spirit of the limb, angry at being severed, crying out through bone and blood. The words didn't matter. What mattered was the screaming. Not every night, but often enough. Loud, sudden, guttural. Not the kind of scream that asked for help. The kind that came from somewhere lower, somewhere deeper. The kind that didn't ask, just happened. And then, just as suddenly, it would stop. The man would lie back down, or curl into himself, or mutter apologies to no one. And the others in the house would pretend to sleep again. There were no cures, no ointments, no charms. The pain wasn't in the stump. It was in the ghost of what used to be. You couldn't press on it, couldn't tie it off, couldn't dig it out with a blade. It throbbed from within, like fire in the marrow, like ice under the skin. Men who had never cried during battle wept like children in the dark. Women bit their fists until they bled, just to stay silent. There was shame in it, not because it hurt, but because it shouldn't. Because the world insisted it was over, that the cut had been made, the wound sealed, the healing begun. And yet, the pain still ruled them. Ruled their sleep, their breath, their waking hours. It dictated what they could carry, how far they could walk, whether or not they could pretend to be whole. And still they endured. Not because they were strong, though many were, but because there was no alternative. The body adjusted to pain, even pain that had no source. They learned when it would come. In the cold, in the rain, in moments of stillness. They learned how to brace for it, how to sit so the ache dulled just slightly, how to distract the mind with quiet chants or repetitive motions. They learned not to scream unless they had to, and when they did, they didn't apologize anymore. They just waited until it passed, because it always passed, not forever, just enough. Enough to rest, enough to eat, enough to live another day with something missing, and something else, invisible but louder, in its place. They called it balance. The body had too much blood, they said, too much heat, too much corruption boiling beneath the skin. So they opened veins, let it drain, drew it out with knives, with cups, with creatures pulled from riverbanks and kept in damp clay jars. Leeches, not rare, not special, just wet, slow-moving mouths that did what people believed was holy work, feeding on illness, drawing out the bad humours, bringing equilibrium to bodies that no longer knew themselves. It didn't matter if the patient had lost a leg or an arm. The treatment stayed the same. Put them in a chair, unwrap the bandage, let the leeches find the wound, and wait. They didn't ask if it made sense. Healing wasn't about logic. It was about tradition, repetition, hope. The leeches were pressed gently against the skin, near the stump, near the blackened edges that still wept and stank. Sometimes they resisted, sliding off with a slow refusal. Other times, they latched on immediately, jaws pulsing as they drank. The sensation was cold at first, then warm, then numb. Patients were told to sit still, to breathe slowly, to let it happen, and many did. Because they had nothing else left, no other cures, no salves that worked, no priests who could explain why the fever stayed. If the leeches helped, even a little, that was enough. And if they didn't, well, at least it looked like something was being done. But not all blood was equal. Not all wounds could afford to lose more of it. Some bodies were already hollowed out, pale and trembling from weeks of illness, barely able to sit upright. And yet the leeches came, again and again. Not in malice, just in ignorance. They drank until the skin purpled, until the lips went white, until the patient slumped forward, mid-session, and never rose again. Their mouths kept feeding even then, unaware that the pulse had stopped. The healers rarely blamed themselves. The sickness was too strong, they'd say. the body too weak. They didn't blame the leeches. How could they? They had done what they were made to do. They had fed. That was their nature. And so the jars were sealed again, the floor cleaned, the name spoken softly to the priest. Another death folded into the silence of the monastery or the back room of a peasant home. Another experiment in balance gone wrong, and yet the next day the leeches were used again, on a different wound, a different arm, a different soul who still believed that healing might come from anything, even the slow, greedy mouths of things that belonged in the mud. Because in the Middle Ages, mercy had many faces, and some of them had teeth. They didn't always say it to your face, but you heard it anyway. In the way voices dropped when you passed, in the way the old woman crossed herself without meeting your eyes, in the way children were pulled back by the sleeve, as if you carried more than a wound, as if you carried a curse, a missing hand, a rotting stump, a leg that ended in leather and ash. These weren't just signs of misfortune. They were marks, warnings, evidence, proof that somewhere, somehow, you had done something wrong. Maybe not this week, maybe not in this village, but somewhere along the line, you had sinned. And this was the price. It didn't matter if the wound had come from a plough or a sword or a falling beam of wood. It didn't matter if you'd cried out to God when it happened. To them, it wasn't just an accident, it was judgment. People liked their world to make sense. Suffering without cause was too frightening, too close, so they gave it meaning. A drunkard loses his foot. Well, there it is. A woman caught stealing loses her fingers in the wheel's spokes. Justice. A soldier who never prayed loses an arm to fire. Divine punishment. And you, even if you were quiet, even if you kept your head low and your mouth shut, became a story others told each other at night. Don't go with him to the forest. Don't touch his crutch. Don't look at the place where the skin turns black. As if the wound might spread like gossip, as if your sin might leap from body to body, like a fever. And so, you were left alone, not with kindness, but with caution. Sometimes the priest confirmed it, not directly, but with words chosen carefully. God tests us in strange ways. The Lord sees all things. What we lose in flesh we must regain in repentance. You knelt with the others during Mass. You bowed your head. You took the wafer on your tongue and tasted nothing, because the space around you never fully filled in again. It was as if the body you lost had dragged your soul partly with it, and now the people around you waited to see what else might fall away. They didn't spit at you. They didn't shun you outright, but they did not invite you close. Your absence, your injury, made them question the certainty of the world. So they turned it into a warning, a parable, a whisper of what happens when you stray. And still you lived. You kept breathing. You tied your shoes with one hand. You carried what you could. You nodded when spoken to and kept your eyes on the ground. Not because you believed them, not fully, but because it was easier than arguing. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe God had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was just bad luck and sharp metal and bad timing. But the whispers were louder than truth. And eventually, even you began to wonder. Not always, not every night, but sometimes, in the cold hour just before dawn, when the wind crept through the cracks in the walls and the stump pulsed like a heartbeat, you asked the question no one had dared say aloud. What if they were right? What if you had deserved this? And what else might be taken, if not? They covered them, always. Long sleeves even in summer. Gloves if they could afford them. Shawls draped carefully to hide the way one shoulder hung lower than the other. Women who had lost a hand, a foot, an eye. They didn't walk through the village like the wounded men did. They didn't beg. They didn't sit by the gate and show their stumps for sympathy. They stayed inside, behind doors, behind curtains, behind silence, because a woman's body wasn't just her own. It was the family's name, the family's future, the family's pride. A damaged daughter couldn't marry. A wounded wife was whispered about. A mother with a twisted arm was pitied in public and mocked in private. So the solution was simple. She disappeared. It didn't happen all at once. At first she still joined the others for chores, limped to the well, tried to stir the pot with her left hand, smiled too much, as if that would distract from the missing fingers. But the looks came quickly, the lowered voices, the offers to help with too much insistence, the way people stopped asking her to join in the baking, the washing, the feast day dances. Children stared. Mothers looked away. And her own family, the ones who had bandaged her, fed her during the fever, wept over her in the dark, began to gently push her aside. Rest today. Stay in. You'll just get cold. It was protection, they said, but it felt like exile. In time, she stopped going out. Not because anyone forbade it, but because the world outside no longer belonged to her. She became a quiet presence in the house, mending torn clothes in the corner, rocking a baby that wasn't hers, watching her sisters braid their hair for market, and knowing she would never be asked if she needed anything. Her wound wasn't spoken of. It wasn't dressed in public. It wasn't acknowledged during prayer. It simply was, like a stain that never faded. The family might still love her, but they loved her more in silence, loved her more when no one else could see. And so she hid, not just the wound, but the parts of herself that remembered being whole. She stopped singing, stopped asking questions, stopped expecting anything beyond the next day's bread and a place to sleep near the stove. Some found peace in that stillness, others never did. But either way, they endured it in silence. Because in the Middle Ages, a woman's worth was sewn into her body, and once the thread snapped, once the skin broke and didn't heal back the right way, the world didn't hate her. It simply turned its face and kept turning, until even she forgot what it felt like to be seen. They cried the same way as others did, high-pitched, panicked, sharp in the throat. It didn't matter how the injury happened, a wagon wheel, a fall, a bite, a careless swing of a tool, too heavy for small arms. There was screaming, and then silence, and then a rush of movement that made the air feel tighter than before. The grown-ups came. Someone wrapped the wound. Someone held the child down. Someone said a prayer they didn't mean. And someone else already looked away, not out of cruelty, just because they knew. A child with a stump didn't have the same future anymore. Not here, not now. There were no tools built for them, no chores adapted, no place at the table for hands that couldn't gather, legs that couldn't run, arms that couldn't pull. The wound wasn't just on the body, it was in the way the world suddenly shifted around them. At first there was hope, always. Children are light, they bounce back. The fever didn't come. The skin started to seal. They laughed again, too soon. They tried to stand, to help, to carry, but it didn't last. Sooner or later, the difference became too large to ignore. They couldn't hold the bucket, couldn't climb the steps, couldn't chase the others without falling and scraping the same sore spot again and again. The mother began to hush them more often. The father grew quiet. The other children learned not to ask where they were, and at some point, the bowl at mealtime was smaller. Not empty, just less. Enough to notice, not enough to argue. Words like weak and delicate started to replace brave and strong. No one said what they meant, but the child heard it anyway. In every lowered voice, in every closed door. Some tried to make themselves useful. They learned to sort grains, to clean the hearth with one arm, to carry firewood in a sling across their back. They smiled too much. They watched the others work and memorized every motion they couldn't perform. They asked questions they already knew the answers to, just to feel included, but it changed nothing. There were too many mouths, too many hands needed in the field. And this one, this wounded, limping, slow one, could not keep pace. They weren't punished, just forgotten. Quietly, day by day, until the food ran low, or the winter came early, or the cow stopped giving milk. And then the forgetting became final. A bowl wasn't set out, a blanket wasn't laid, no one screamed, no one sobbed. They just didn't wake up the next morning. Or if they did, they weren't carried outside. The ground took them without ceremony. No songs, no carved marker, A name spoken once, maybe twice, and then never again. The family survived. That's what mattered. That's what had to matter. The others needed feeding. The others could still carry, still haul, still kneel in the field and rise without help. A child with a stump wasn't a child for long. Not in a world where every breath was measured and every mouth was a burden or a blessing. They didn't grow old, not because no one cared, but because no one knew how to keep them. And in the quiet after they were gone, no one asked what could have been done, because the answer was too sharp, and the silence was easier. They started by dragging themselves. Across straw, across dirt, across stone floors slick with cold. The arms took over what the legs had lost. Palms blistered, then calloused, elbows bruised. Ribs ached from the twisting, but crawling was only temporary, or at least that's what they told themselves. Because standing meant something, even if it was with help, even if it hurt. So the wood was shaped, rough and thick, cut from discarded fence posts or broken handles, whittled down just enough to fit beneath an armpit or into the bend of an elbow. Crutches, if you could call them that. Wooden sticks bound in scraps of old leather, knotted in places where nails couldn't hold. They didn't look like salvation, but they meant motion. The first steps were chaos, not heroic, not graceful, a strange lurching rhythm, half hop, half fall, with sweat soaking through the back before they'd even cleared the doorway. The crutches bit into the flesh, rubbed it raw, bruised bone with every step. But still, it was movement, forward, upright. It didn't matter how crooked the gait was, how loud the breath became, how the muscles screamed from the effort. Every inch earned felt like defiance, against the wound, against the stillness, against the soft, silent pity that filled a room when the injured lay still too long. They walked because they needed to, because being upright meant they could still be seen, still take part, still matter. No one made the crutches for them. They made them themselves, or begged someone to help. A neighbour, a cousin, the blacksmith's son who carved wood for wheels and coffins. Some used goat bone to reinforce the structure. Others tied strips of wool around the grip to ease the pain. None of it lasted long. The wood cracked, the leather frayed, the knots slipped. But when the tools failed, the will didn't. They repaired, rewrapped, reshaped. Sometimes they added a third crutch, dragging it behind them as a makeshift seat when the limbs gave out. They learned how to balance on uneven roads, how to brace against doors, how to fall without breaking the good parts. And they fell often. Always alone, never loudly, but no one asked what it felt like. The pain, the shame, the cold that settled in the stump after hours of walking through wet grass. The skin that split beneath the strap. The dreams of running, cruel and vivid. It wasn't spoken of, because it was personal, private. The price of walking again wasn't measured in distance, it was measured in endurance, in how long they could pretend the pain wasn't there, in how many steps they could take before sitting down in the shadows, out of sight, and letting the tears come quietly. No one clapped when they stood. No one watched when they limped across the yard. But still, they walked, on wood, on bone, on something stubborn inside them that refused to stay still. And that was enough. Not to heal, not to forget, but to keep going, one uneven step at a time. It didn't happen in battle. It didn't happen with banners or iron. It happened in the woods, or in the barn, or out beyond the pasture where no one could hear the scream. A flash of fur, a crash through underbrush, a sudden weight driving a body to the ground. Sometimes it was a wolf, lean, desperate, silent until its teeth found flesh. Sometimes it was a wild boar, rage and muscle and tusks like curved knives. Sometimes it was the family dog gone feral, a moment of madness no one could explain. The teeth didn't hesitate. They clamped down and ripped, not with precision but with panic. The leg twisted. The arm bent backward. The hand, if caught, was gone before the brain could register the pain. And when the animal ran, or was driven off, or simply left, the body that remained was something changed forever. Not a victim, not a survivor, something in between. They didn't call it an accident. Not really. not even if they saw it happen. A man who lost his foot to a bear trap was unlucky. A boy who lost his leg to a horse kick was foolish. But a person torn by an animal, that was something else. That was a sign. A message. Punishment. For what? No one said aloud, but the whispers came quickly. He went too far into the woods. She was out after dark. He never prays. She speaks too freely. The animal might have been hungry, wild, frightened, but the wound it left behind was treated like justice. The wound spoke louder than the scream, and long after the blood dried, the story lived on, twisted and stained with suspicion. The injured knew this. They felt it before the fever came, in the way people looked at them, not with sympathy, but with distance, with restraint, as if the bite had marked them with something more than teeth. No one asked for details. No one wanted to hear how it happened. They wanted to believe it had been earned, that it made sense, that it wouldn't happen to them, because they were good, obedient, careful. And so the bitten were left alone, bandaged maybe, fed sometimes, but not embraced, not remembered as they were, only as what they had become, one-armed, one-legged, one step removed from the life they had known. The stump was not just flesh, it was proof, and still life had to go on. They learned to move again, to work again, to exist in a body that people believed had been corrected by pain. They didn't argue. What would be the point? They wrapped the wound, swallowed the shame, avoided the woods. They kept quiet. Let others tell the story, the one where they deserved it, the one where the wolf had been an agent of justice. And in the quiet hours when the wind scraped across the roof and the animals growled in their pens, they wondered, not if it had been deserved, but if it would ever stop following them. The pain, the suspicion, the curse that wore their skin and limped beside them wherever they went. There were no records, no pages in dusty books, no sermons, no songs. The names of the wounded were not written down, and their stories were not passed from mouth to mouth. They vanished behind the silence of daily life, where only the strong were celebrated and only the whole were remembered. A man who lost his leg was not given a place in history. A woman who hid her missing hand beneath folds of cloth was not painted in the margins of scripture. The pain, the screams, the slow recovery, the nights spent awake watching the shadows move across the rafters, none of it was captured. Not because it was shameful, but because it didn't fit. Wounds were messy. Survival was slow, and nothing about that made for a clean tale. People didn't ask what it felt like. They didn't sit beside the injured and ask how it had happened, or what it meant to move through the world, half as strong as before. They didn't want to know, maybe because the answers were too close, maybe because they feared it could be them next. A slipped axe, a kicked horse, a wrong step in a dark field. So they nodded from a distance. They offered food sometimes. A gesture, but not curiosity. And over time, the silence thickened. The wounded learned not to speak of it either. They described the weather instead, the harvest, the new baby, anything but the truth of what they lived with, every hour, in skin that didn't match the rest of the village anymore. When it did come up, briefly, indirectly, it was always as a lesson. Don't play too close to the well. Hold the knife properly, or you'll end up like him. She walks like that because she angered someone, they say. The wound became a warning, not a story of endurance, not a mark of survival, but a cautionary image with no voice. And so even those who had survived the worst, who had endured the cut and the fever and the years of limping afterward, were reduced to a gesture, a half glance, a story stripped of detail, and they lived in that emptiness, day after day. Not because they were forgotten, but because remembering too clearly made everyone else feel vulnerable. In time they stopped remembering themselves. The details blurred. How long the pain lasted, who sat beside them on the first night, what they said to God when they didn't know, if they'd lived to see the morning. It all dulled into silence, the kind that settled in the bones, the kind that made them look out at the others and know they were no longer truly part of them. No one asked, no one told, and somewhere between the unspoken questions and the unspoken answers, the truth disappeared, not erased, just left untouched. Like a scar hidden beneath thick fabric, always there, but never seen. They weren't elegant, just two pieces of wood, often uneven, sometimes cracked, held together with strips of leather or coarse rope. But they made all the difference. With them you could stand. You could move through the village without dragging your knees through the mud. You could rest your weight under your arms and look people in the eye, even if they didn't want to meet your gaze. Crutches didn't erase the wound. They didn't stop the pain, but they turned you from a thing that was pitied into a thing that was tolerated, maybe even helped. You didn't seem helpless anymore, just broken in a way that could be managed. And in the harsh arithmetic of daily life, that small shift meant everything. A man without crutches didn't stand a chance. He crawled through filth, through puddles, through pig droppings and straw. His clothes turned dark with wet. His hands blistered from the stones. His voice barely carried when he asked for bread, because no one wanted to stop for someone sprawled flat on the road. People saw you differently when you stood, even if you wobbled, even if your breath came in wheezes and your legs shook beneath the effort. Standing meant agency, meant presence, and presence could earn a coin, a crust, a nod. But crawling erased you. It turned you into something between an animal and a warning. Something to step around, something to ignore. Making crutches wasn't easy. They had to be shaped to your body, to your height, to the strange new rhythm your limbs demanded. They had to be strong enough to hold the full weight of a man who had nothing left below the knee. And if they broke, as they often did, you were stuck, sitting in the road, waiting for someone to pass who might care enough to stop. Some tied bones to the tips for strength. Others wrapped wool around the tops to soften the pain beneath the arms. You learned quickly that every inch of wood mattered, every knot in the rope, every creak before a crack. You inspected them like others inspected shoes or saddles, because if they failed, so did you. And so you walked, slowly, carefully, with the whole world watching or pretending not to. You clacked across the cobblestones. You sank in the mud. You kept moving because stopping meant fading. You held the bowl out when you could, or just sat and waited for the hand to reach down. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, but you were upright. And that mattered, because the moment you were too weak to lift yourself, the moment the wood gave out or the arm buckled beneath you, you'd be back on the ground. And no one gave to the man who crawled, not because they hated him, but because something about seeing him made them afraid, and fear, in a world like that, was reason enough to look away. Crutches were more than wood. They were your last chance to be human. They had to do something. No one could afford a mouth that didn't also bring something to the table, even if that table was just a wooden board balanced on two stones. If you had one good arm, they found a way to use it. Not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Weaving was common, not the big looms, not the ones that required strength and rhythm and both feet planted firm on the floor, but smaller work. Cord, wool, mending, spinning flax into thread, if your fingers were still nimble enough. They gave you a stool in the corner, near the fire or near the draught, and expected silence. You weren't a guest, you were a tool. One that still worked, just barely, if handled right. You didn't ask questions. You didn't set your own pace, the others wove faster. That didn't matter. Yours just had to be clean. Other tasks were less forgiving. If you couldn't spin, if your hands trembled or your stump still ached when it rained, there were always chamber pots. Someone had to carry them, empty them behind the barn or into the ditch near the edge of the village. It wasn't noble, it wasn't clean, but it didn't take two arms. And so the crippled carried buckets of waste in the dark hours of morning when the rest of the house still slept. They moved slowly, careful not to spill, knowing that if they did, they wouldn't be asked to help again. Not because of the mess, but because no one wanted to be reminded how close the body could come to failing completely. They scrubbed rags, washed clothes in cold rivers, picked lice from bedding, tasks that didn't require limbs, just silence, Children stared. Sometimes they laughed, but mostly they avoided eye contact. The wounded weren't taught. They were handed tools and told what to do. If they asked how, the answer was a shrug or a pointed glance at someone else who was already doing it. You learned by watching, or by being punished, not harshly, just with less food, with cold glances, with the sound of your name being left out when bread was passed around. And so you learned, slowly, imperfectly, but well enough to survive. Your hands bled, your back ached, you dropped things, but eventually your presence became normal again, not welcome, but accepted. A chair in the corner, a body that still moved if not fully, and in time that became its own rhythm. You weren't the weaver, you weren't the washer, you were the one-armed one, the quiet one, the one who didn't speak unless asked. That was your place now, not a role of pride, but a space that wouldn't be taken from you as long as you stayed useful. You didn't complain, you didn't ask for more, you just worked, slow and steady, letting the thread slip through your fingers, letting the pot empty without a word, letting the days pass in quiet repetition. Because in that repetition, there was a kind of safety, a kind of invisibility. And for someone who had once been broken loudly, invisibility was the only thing that felt close to peace. Everyone lived with pain. It wasn't rare, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't something you whispered about at night, because it was already there, in every breath, every movement, every step across frozen ground or uneven stone. Some pain came from hunger, from joints that stiffened before rain, from blisters that turned to sores and never fully healed. Others lived with deeper pain, the kind that came from old wounds, missing limbs, burns that hardened the skin like bark. But no one asked, "How bad is it today?" No one offered sympathy unless the blood was still fresh. Pain wasn't news, it wasn't tragedy, it was a backdrop, like smoke from the fire, or the smell of waste near the ditch, or the wind that cut through the cracks in the door. It was always there. And because it was always there, no one stopped to name it. You didn't explain it to others. There weren't words for the way a stump pulsed before the rain came, or how your fingers burned from old breaks that never mended properly, or how your back screamed from bending too long under a sack of grain that no one offered to help carry. You winced, maybe. You sat down slower. You pressed your palm against the pain and kept your voice steady, because talking about it wouldn't change anything. The others were hurting too, just differently. A mother with cracked nipples from feeding a hungry child, a boy whose foot never healed right after falling from a cart, an old man who hadn't slept in years because the cold had settled into his bones. Everyone ached, and so no one expected relief. They expected endurance. Even priests didn't speak of pain as something to be avoided. They spoke of it as proof that you were alive, that you were being tested, that your body was burning away the sin that clung to it from birth. Pain, they said, was part of the path. Carry it quietly, offer it up, turn it into prayer. So people did, not because it brought comfort, but because it gave the suffering a shape, a frame, something to hang it on, so it wouldn't hang on you. You woke with pain. You worked with pain. You slept with pain, if sleep came at all. And when someone groaned too loudly or cried out without restraint, they were met not with horror, but with irritation, as if they'd let the fire go out or spilled soup on the floor. There were limits to what was allowed, even in agony, so pain settled into the village like dust, in the clothes, in the wood, in the voices that grew quieter with each passing season. It didn't mean you were weak. It didn't mean you were cursed. It just meant you were part of the world. And the world didn't care how much it hurt. The wind blew. The water stank. The bones ached. You worked anyway. You moved anyway. You laughed sometimes anyway. And when the pain spiked, when it hollowed you out and made the world spin, you gritted your teeth and waited for it to pass. Not because you believed it would, but because you had no choice. Pain was the floor beneath everything else, and no one in the Middle Ages got to live above it. Winter didn't just come, it settled. Slowly at first, and in the breath that turned white in the morning, in the way the straw felt colder under your back, in the ache that crept into old wounds and never left again. For the wounded, it was more than a season. It was a sentence, a trial by cold that lasted months, without pause, without mercy. If you were missing a hand, the blood flowed slower on that side. If you had no foot, the entire leg turned stiff by sundown. A stump, even wrapped in wool and fur and rags, still ached from the inside. Not sharp pain. Worse, that dull, endless freezing that settled in the bone and made your entire body curl in on itself, just to keep the warmth from leaking out. But curling helped little. The cold got in anyway. It always did. People didn't offer their places by the fire, not without reason. Wood was scarce. Even scraps were measured. A warm spot by the hearth was for the ones who still worked, who chopped the wood, who stirred the pot, who milked the goat at dawn with fingers that still bent. If you had one hand, you had half the value. If you had no legs, you had no value at all. So you sat further back, near the wall, near the draught. You warmed yourself with breath and with luck. Some tied hot stones into the folds of their clothes. Others just didn't sleep, because the cold made the joints seize and the skin split, and the stump pulse like a second bitter heart. No one talked about it. They just saw the way your lips cracked and your fingers curled, and they turned back to the fire without speaking. The clothes didn't help. They were patched from too many winters ago. The sleeves hung awkwardly on arms that were no longer there. Gloves were cut and re-sewn into mitts that barely held to skin. You wrapped your wound in whatever you could find. Wool soaked with old grease, leather stiff with salt, linen that had once been white and was now the colour of ash. Still, the wind found its way in, through the stitches, through the open seams, through the thin space between body and fabric, where warmth was supposed to be. Some people burned straw in buckets when they could. You didn't get near those buckets. They were for children, for elders, for the sick who still had both hands to hold the edge of the bowl. You sat behind. You waited for someone to leave. They didn't, and so you froze, quietly. Not in the way of stories, not in snowdrifts or lost forests, but in rooms filled with people who didn't look at you. You learned how to sleep in pieces by a few minutes curled around your stump, a few more with your back to the wind, then awake again, shivering. You learned how to eat with stiff fingers, how to breathe through pain that tightened with each night. You stopped asking to move closer to the fire. You stopped hoping someone would offer. And when you dreamed of summer, of the kind of warmth that reached the inside of the body and stayed there. But dreams ended. Winter didn't. It stayed long after the ice began to melt. Because the cold wasn't only outside, it lived in the wound, in the breath, in the silence around you. Winter was not just weather, it was judgment. And you were still paying for something no one would name. You thought you had it hard until you saw him. No arms, not one, not a stump, not a sleeve pinned neatly to a shoulder. Nothing. Just a man hunched near the wall of the stable, wrapped in old cloth, with a rope around his waist to hold what remained of a tunic together. He didn't speak often, not because he was mute, but because no one asked him anything worth answering. You never heard anyone call his name. Maybe he had one once. Maybe someone somewhere had whispered it in the dark. But here, in the village, in the frost-bitten morning when everyone looked busy to avoid pity, he was just him. A figure, a shadow, a reminder that pain didn't have a floor, only layers. He didn't beg, not like the others. He couldn't hold a bowl, couldn't raise his eyes in the same way. So he just sat. Sometimes by the well, sometimes outside the church, sometimes in the hay where the children played until their mothers pulled them away. Food showed up near him now and then, a crust placed in the straw, a scrap of cheese. No one saw who left it. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was duty, but never more than what kept him breathing. No one offered to feed him. He used his mouth, his chin, his shoulder, awkward, slow and silent. People glanced, then looked away. You did too, because watching meant remembering, and remembering meant accepting that there was no bottom, that there was always worse. When you complained about your own pain, when the stump itched in the night, or the crutch bruised your ribs, or you couldn't carry water without dropping half of it, you thought of him, and the complaint died before it reached your tongue. What did you have to say that could outweigh the image of a man crawling into the shadow of a barn to piss, using only his hips and the friction of the ground? What injury of yours could match the cold loneliness of someone who couldn't even hold a hand to his own chest in prayer? No one wanted to think about what it meant to live that way, so they didn't. They left him outside the edge of their thoughts, the way they left him outside the edge of the firelight, and yet he survived, day after day, season after season. Not loudly, not proudly, just barely. His presence became background, a fact. Like the creak in the door or the smell of manure, not worth noticing unless it changed. And because he was always there, always quiet, always still, people stopped feeling anything about him at all. He wasn't cruelly treated, he wasn't mocked, he was simply ignored. Not because no one cared, but because caring demanded too much. It forced people to admit that they, too, were only one step away. One fire, one fall, one slip of the axe, and then they'd be sitting beside him, nameless and unseen. So they looked away, and you did too, because someone always had it worse, and knowing that didn't make your pain smaller, just quieter. They told you it wouldn't last, that the pain, the shame, the crooked body you carried through the world, it was only temporary. That, after death, it would be returned to you whole. The hand you lost, the leg that never healed, the skin that had blackened and fallen away. God, they said, would give it all back. Not just the flesh, but the dignity that had slowly drained from you with every step away from the life you once had. Heaven, they promised, held no stumps, no twisted spines, no empty sleeves. There you would walk upright again. You would lift. You would run. You would be seen for what you once were, or what you were meant to be. The priests didn't speak of this loudly. They spoke in low, steady voices, during vespers or over the beds of the dying. They touched the forehead, made the sign, whispered of reunion, not just with loved ones, but with your own self. You listened. Sometimes you believed, not always, but enough to get through another night. Enough to sit by the fire, one step removed, and imagine yourself whole. Enough to look at the hand you didn't have and picture its return. Stronger, unscarred, untouched by the things that had broken you. They said heaven held the shape of your best self. Not the body you left behind, but the body you deserved. It brought comfort, but also distance, because that promise was always later, after, beyond, and you still had to live in this one. The world where people winced when they saw your wound, where your shoes never matched, where your work was halved and your worth halved again. You still had to eat with difficulty, still had to walk with effort, still had to sit alone while the others danced. So the idea of a perfect body became a kind of private ritual, something you returned to in silence, like prayer. You didn't expect others to see it. You just hoped it was true, that when the pain finally ended, something waited beyond it, something that made all of this feel less like punishment and more like passage. And in the quiet moments, it helped. When your stump throbbed and the cold bit deeper than the blankets allowed. When the village passed you by again. When even the priest forgot your name. You closed your eyes and pictured yourself standing without effort. Opening a door without hesitation. Holding a cup with both hands. They said heaven was eternal. But for you, it was just long enough to be whole again. And if that was the trade, to suffer here in this broken shell, in exchange for the promise of walking into the next world without a limp, you accepted it. Not because you were devout, but because hope, however distant, was the only thing that didn't rot. You woke each day, but something didn't come with you. It stayed behind, maybe in the straw where you bled, maybe in the fever that cracked your lips, maybe in the hand or leg they carried away and buried without a word. You ate, not much, not always, but enough to keep your ribs from showing. You breathed, shallow at times when the cold pressed down or when the stump flared with pain. Your body moved, not freely, not gracefully, but it moved. You slept when you could. You answered when spoken to. You sat where they told you. You lived, and that, in itself, was rare enough to count as a kind of victory. But living didn't mean returning. It didn't mean being whole. It meant carrying the shape of a person long after the person had gone quiet inside. The people around you adjusted. They no longer flinched when they saw the wound. They no longer offered help unless you asked. You became part of the room, like the hearth or the bucket or the broom by the door. Useful sometimes, in the way, forgotten and then remembered when something needed mending or moving or cleaning. No one was cruel, no one said you were less, but they no longer expected more. The eyes that once saw you as a son, a brother, a worker, now saw a shadow of that. A version, thinner, quieter, duller. You didn't laugh as often, not because you were bitter, but because there were fewer moments that made laughter feel natural. You didn't speak unless necessary. Words cost more when your presence already asked too much. You watched others grow, children who hadn't yet learned what pain could take, men who still stood tall, still gripped tools with both hands, still chased after dogs and cartwheels without fear of falling. Women who carried water in both arms, who danced at feast days, who didn't have to think twice about where to place their feet. You didn't envy them. You simply observed, as if watching someone else's life play out through a window. You remembered what it felt like to run, to hold something without fumbling, to wake up without dread. But memory softened with time, became more suggestion than certainty. You weren't sure after a while if those moments had really belonged to you, or if they were borrowed from a better story someone else had lived, and so you existed, not joyfully, not tragically, but steadily, like a candle that burned lower than the rest but refused to go out. You kept warm when you could. You did what work your body allowed. You answered to your name even when it no longer sounded like yours. You didn't ask for more. You didn't wait for less. And when you looked at your reflection, in a pail of water, in the shine of iron, in the glassy eyes of someone passing by, you didn't see yourself. You saw the outline, the echo. You had survived, yes, but not as before. And in a world like this, survival came without applause, only silence, only the steady, breathless march of days that no longer cared who you used to be. Maybe you're still here, listening, quietly. Maybe the story faded into the background, or maybe it stayed with you, closer than expected. There's no lesson to take from this, no message hidden in the dust. Just the simple truth that people endured, not because they were brave, but because they had no other choice. If the world feels a little quieter now, a little heavier, that's all right. Let it sit with you. Let it pass like a slow wind across old stone. There's no need to shake it off. Not yet. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the day fall away, and if sleep comes, let it come gently. You're safe now, warmer, whole, and still.